Hello everyone and welcome to Instant Biology by Dr. Neela. Today we are going to talk about another topic that is related to analytical techniques, and basically we would be talking about a topic that is related to microscopy. Now we have talked about multiple microscopic techniques in the past, and many of the videos were in Hindi. This would be in English. I have already made this particular topic, that is fluorescence microscopy, in Hindi. So those of you who are interested in listening to that in Hindi, they can watch that video. I would be posting the link, and you can see the link on the screen also at the end, and you can check out that video if you are comfortable in Hindi. But if you are interested in English, then this is the video that you would be better off. So what is fluorescence microscopy? Before starting, I would request you, I have a very humble request, that if you think that the content that is present in this channel helps you out and is useful for you, please do subscribe the channel. It helps us to be motivated and work harder each time. So without much ado, let us start. What is fluorescence microscopy? Now fluorescence microscopy actually is the need of the hour. Basically, one more advanced version of fluorescence microscopy, that is confocal microscopy, is used nowadays. It has much more enhanced features, confocal microscopy. We would be talking about that also in one of the upcoming videos, but in today's lecture I would be discussing about fluorescence microscopy. So what is fluorescence microscopy? Understand that in fluorescence microscopy, the specimen itself acts as a light source. Now you would understand that in general, when we were using light microscopy, you might have or you could remember that when we were using light microscopy, we had to put light, or we had to use an external light source. But what will happen over here, the specimen will itself act as a light source. How does that happen? Let us understand this. Suppose this is our specimen, okay? Suppose this is our specimen. What we will do is we will coat this specimen with fluorophores. What we'll do is we'll coat this specimen with fluorophores. And what are fluorophores? Fluorophores are certain dyes, are certain chemicals that have the ability to emit fluorescence. Okay, you would have understood what is fluorophores. Let me just say it again. Fluorophores are the chemicals or the dyes that have the ability to do fluorescence. Okay, so what I'm saying is, in this condition, the specimen will itself serve as a light source. How it will serve as a light source, I'll just tell you in a few moments. Now, the specimen that can be studied is of two types. Basically, you can divide the specimens that can be studied through this technique in two broad areas. Now, if you remember, we had discussed that when we were talking about the normal light microscopy or bright field light microscopy, we said that we can only use specimens that have been stained, right? And in case of dark microscopy, dark field microscopy, we said that we can visualize the specimens that are unstained also. That means that do not require stain. Similarly, in phase contrast microscopy, we said that we can visualize light, we can visualize those specimens that are living, right? In electron microscopy, we said that only dead specimens can be observed. So similarly, over here, the specimens that can be studied are fluorescent materials and that are stained with the fluorescent dyes. One can be, you can directly visualize a fluorescent material. Suppose a material is able to emit out fluorescence, then you can directly observe it under the light, under the fluorescence microscope. But if a material or a specimen is non-fluorescent, what can you do? You can stain it with a fluorescent dye. So the second one is that I am talking about, stained with fluorescent dyes. The first one was fluorescent material, that has the normal capacity of emitting out fluorescence. So these are the two types of specimen that can be used under fluorescence microscopy, or that can be visualized under fluorescence microscopy. I hope this is clear. Now understand, I have been using the term fluorescence since this video started, right? What does fluorescence mean? What do you understand from fluorescence, right? So understand this, or let us talk about fluorescence. What does fluorescence mean? Now you would understand that whenever an external light or whenever an external energy hits an object, the electrons present inside this object will be jumping towards the higher orbital. This we have studied multiple times. You would have studied in this this type of things in lower classes, right? So whenever there is a material, you are striking it with energy source, or you are striking it with a photon, that can be the much more correct term. You are striking it with a photon, then photon contains energy, right? Now when the light source strikes this object, the electrons present over here, they will jump to the higher orbital. This you would have understood. Now after jumping to the higher orbital, when these electrons will lose energy, they will tend to come down to the ground state, right? After losing energy, they will tend to come down to the ground state, and during this time they will tend to lose energy, and this energy is called as fluorescence, right? Firstly, what happened is the photons struck over here, then the electrons present in this material, it went up into the higher orbital, and from the higher orbital, these electrons, when they come down, they tend to emit out energy in the form of fluorescence. This is called as fluorescence. Let me understand, or let me help you understand this in a much better way, or with the help of a diagram. But before that, let me make you understand one more thing, that the light that is striking over here, understand this, that the light that is striking over here and the fluorescence that would be emitted out, they are different in the energies, right? Of course, you would understand this pretty clear, because the light that is falling over here is higher in energy, and then there would be some energy absorbed by this object, and only then the electrons will be jumping to the higher orbital. Now when the electron would be coming down to the ground state, then the energy that is released is called as fluorescence. Now definitely this fluorescence would be having energy lesser than the energy that was present in this photon. Definitely. Why? Because there will be some energy that would be absorbed by this material, and only then the electrons will be jumping to the higher orbital. I believe you would have this clear cut in mind. So this is what I have drawn over here. If you see, let me just change the color of my pen. So this is the incident light. So this is having h nu, this is photons, right? Incident light, and it is falling on an object. What is this? This is an object, sir, right? When the light is falling on the object, what happens is the object emits, or the electrons present inside the object, they rise to the higher orbital, and when they come down, they tend to emit light. What is this? They are emitting light, and when the light is emitted, let us say that the wavelength of the light emitted is lambda 2, and the wavelength of the light that was striking was lambda 1. So it is always a fact that lambda 2 would be greater than lambda 1. That means the wavelength of the emitted light will always be higher than the wavelength of the incident light. Why is that so, sir? Why is that so? Because you would definitely remember that there was a formula that you were taught when you were in basic classes. E is equals to hc upon lambda, right? Now E is equals to hc by lambda. Here h is constant, and here c is also constant. So what you can do is you can derive a proportionality, an inverse proportionality relationship between energy and wavelength. That means if energy is high, then definitely wavelength will be low, and alternatively, if energy is less, wavelength will definitely be high. This is the relationship between the energy and the wavelength. I hope you would have understood this, right? Okay. Now understand this, that when I am talking about the light that is incident, it is definitely higher in energy. Why? Because some of the energy was absorbed by this object, and only then this object was allowing the electrons to flow up in the higher orbital, and after that the electrons were coming down. So definitely the energy that was incident was having higher energy, or the light that was incident was having higher energy, and the light that was emitted in the form of fluorescence is having lower energy. That means E1 would always be greater than E2. That means let us say this is E1 and this is E2. So E1 will definitely be greater than E2. If E1 is greater than E2, then definitely lambda 1 will be lesser than lambda 2, or in other words, lambda 2 would be greater than lambda 1. So this you have to understand, and this comes in the examination also. We would be covering all the points that are important for different life science examinations. Remember that CSIR, DBT, GATE, all the examinations, all the points that come from this particular section, we would be covering that. Okay, so lambda 2 would be greater than lambda 1. Up till here you have understood. What did I say about fluorophores? Fluorophores are chemicals or dyes that are required for staining substances, right? And of course these fluorophores have the ability to get excited to the higher orbital electrons, of course, and when they come back they emit energy. This is the main feature of fluorophores. Let me show this with the help of a diagram. What did I say? That suppose the energy that is incident is over here. Let us say that the energy is E1. Because of the energy E1, what happens is the electrons rise up and reach to different higher orbitals, but they cannot stay in this higher orbital for longer period of times. They are unstable in the higher orbitals. Now you can take the analogy of yourself only. If you are very excited, if you are very energetic, you cannot stay very energetic for a longer period of time. That is an unstable state. You will definitely have to come down, right, in the ground state. So what happens over here is that when the electron comes down, then the fluorescence is emitted. Over here you can see it is written that fluorescence is being emitted. Understood this? Now this is what we observe in case of fluorescence microscopy. I'll just be showing you a couple of diagrams to make that much clear in your mind. Okay, let us move on to the next slide. And excitation and emission spectra of fluorophore is distinct and it depends upon atomic structure and electron resonance properties. What do you mean by this? Now there are different types of fluorophore, guys. There are different types of fluorophores, and the excitation and emission spectra. What do you mean by excitation? Not all fluorophores can absorb a particular light. Different fluorophores will absorb a particular light and it will emit a particular light. So those are the characteristic intrinsic features of fluorophores. You cannot say, or you cannot excite all the fluorophores by one single light, right? That is why we are saying that the excitation, that means how do you excite it, with which wavelength of light you are exciting a particular fluorophore, or which wavelength of light the fluorophore is emitting after getting excited. Both are different for different fluorophores. And what do they depend upon? They depend upon the atomic structure and electron resonance properties of that fluorophore. Atomic structure, that means what or how many electrons are present, how many orbitals are there, plus the electron resonance properties are also one of the factors on which these two things depend. What are the examples of fluorescent dyes or fluorophores? What are the examples? Now two very commonly used fluorophores or fluorescent dyes are fluorescein and rhodamine. What do you mean by fluorescein, or what wavelength of light can we use as an excitation light for fluorescein? You can use blue light. Understand this. When you incident a blue light on fluorescein, what happens is that it will emit out as fluorescence one particular light that would be green in color. How is that possible, sir? Let us see this. Now you would have studied that, yes, you would have studied that electromagnetic radiation in case of the visible region, right? Visible region, this is VIBGYOR, violet, indigo, blue, green, yellow, orange and red. Now if you start from here till here, let us say that the wavelength is 400 over here, wavelength is 700 over here. This is in nanometers. Okay, now if you are using blue colored light for exciting the fluorescence, the fluorophore, sorry, if you are exciting the fluorophore with blue colored light, then definitely the light that would be emitted out would be higher in wavelength or a lower in wavelength. Of course it would be higher in wavelength. Why? Because the energy of the incident light was higher, therefore wavelength of the emitted light should be higher. So what happens is, if you are using blue as the incident light, then definitely green has to be the emitted light, or of course it can be anything just after blue. So over here it happens to be green in color, the light that is emitted out. So this was about the first fluorophore. This was the fluorescein. Let us talk about the next one, that is rhodamine. So rhodamine, in case of rhodamine, the light that you are using for excitation purpose is green yellow light. It is greenish yellow, right? So suppose this is the greenish yellow, this is used as an incident light. Again, now the light that would be emitted out in the form of fluorescence would be somewhere over here, because again the wavelength will increase, so it will be yellow in color. So yellow, or you can say deep red in color. So over here it is deep red in color. So in case of fluorescein, this was the case. In case of rhodamine, if I say you are using the green yellow light and the emitted light is red in color, deep red in color. I hope this is clear in your mind, that whenever you are incident or whenever you are using an incident light, the emitted light will always have a wavelength higher than the incident light. This should be very clear in your mind. So I hope this is understandable. Let us move on to the next slide. Yes. Now, one very important feature in case of fluorescence or the fluorescence microscopy is that there is a shift, as you would have seen or you would have observed, that there is a difference between the wavelengths of the emitted and the incident light. So this was the emitted light, the wavelength is over here. You can see, let us say that this is wavelength number 2, lambda 2, and the light that you were using for incidence, this is over here, and let us say that this is lambda 1. This is lambda 1. Now what you can observe over here is that there is a marked difference between lambda 2 and lambda 1. There is a large difference. Now this difference in the wavelength in case of fluorescence is called as, or is given a particular name called as Stokes shift. Very important. It is called as Stokes shift. This shifting of the wavelength from the lower wavelength to the higher wavelength, or incident wavelength to the emitted out wavelength, is called as Stokes shift. Let us move on to the next slide. Now, what are the components of fluorescence microscopy? What are the components? What are the different features? Now, when we are talking about fluorescence microscopy, there are three chief features in this microscopy. One is excitation filter, the second one is dichroic mirror, the third one is emission or barrier filter. We would be talking about this, and we would also be seeing the diagrammatic representation of fluorescence microscopy. First of all, excitation filter, it is also called as band pass filter. Let us see this, excitation filter or band pass filter. Now over here you can see that this is the fluorescence microscopy diagrammatic representation. Now if I want to check out the entire working of a fluorescence microscope, we would have to shift to this diagram. Now over here you can see this is a light source. Now the light source is emitting light. Since this is a bulb, you can see that this is a bulb, and this bulb, of course, it is emitting white light, let us say. Okay, if it is emitting out white light, you would understand that white light is a mixture of 7 colors, V, I, B, G, Y, O, R, Vibgyor. Okay, now over here you can see the excitation filter. This is what we were talking about a little while ago over here, and this is also called as band pass filter. Excitation filter is also called as band pass filter. Now what is the function of excitation filter? Understand that this particular light source is having multiple wavelengths of light, isn't it? This light source, it is having multiple wavelengths of light, but do we require all those wavelengths? No. Why? Because we require only a particular wavelength that would be required for exciting the fluorophore that has been coated upon our sample. Now you can see that this is our sample. Now this sample, since we are working in case of fluorescence microscopy, this sample will definitely be coated with fluorophore. Right? Now when you are coating it with fluorophore, therefore you require a particular wavelength of light to incident upon the fluorophore so that it can emit out light as a fluorescence. Right? Now what you are using over here is excitation filter. Excitation filter will cut off all the other lights that are not required and only pass that light which is required for exciting that particular fluorophore. Okay, so you can see that it has cut off all the other lights. For a matter of example, we are seeing that it is only allowing a blue colored light over here. Now this blue colored light, or you can see that light, you can say that light of a particular wavelength falls on the specimen. Remember, specimen was coated with fluorophore. As soon as the light falls, the fluorophore gets excited. Electron moves to the higher orbital. When it comes back, fluorescent light is emitted out. Now understand this, the fluorescence light, you can see that this is green in color. Do you remember I told you VIBGYOR, VIBGYOR. So this is just an example of fluorescein fluorophore. In case of fluorescein fluorophore, what did I say? That you have to use a blue colored light as an incident light, and the fluorescence that you would get would be green in color because the wavelength will be increasing in this direction. So the next wavelength would be green in color. Now the same thing is happening over here. You are getting green colored light. One more important feature I forgot to tell you is that this dichroic mirror. What is it? What is this dichroic? Di means two. It has two functions to perform. What are the functions? Now when the light had a higher energy or a lower wavelength, now you can see that this light had a higher energy and lower wavelength. We can talk in terms of wavelength only. So when the wavelength was lower, this mirror basically allowed the light to pass, it allowed the light to strike to it, and then it reflected the light. You can see that the dichroic mirror is at an angle of 45 degree to the specimen also, and it is at an angle of 45 degree to the light source also. So it is something like this, and the light is striking like this, so it is moving down. After striking this mirror, it is getting reflected, it is moving down. This was the first feature. That means whenever the wavelength of light is less, this will serve as a source of reflection, this dichroic mirror. But when the light is reflected back and it is striking the, it is striking the sample beneath. After striking the sample, you definitely would be knowing that the wavelength of light will have been or would be increased. The wavelength of light would be increased. Now when the wavelength of light will be again moving upwards, you can see this, that the wavelength of light is moving upwards. In this process, again this 45 degree dichroic mirror is encountered in the way. But now for the higher wavelength of light, this dichroic mirror will serve as no obstacle. It will just allow this wavelength, this light to pass through it. You can see that the light is just passing through this. It is not getting reflected just like the previous light or the incident light. This is the function of dichroic mirror. Dichroic means two colored. Chroic, chrome means colored. Okay, I believe you would have understood. Now there is another one more accessory over here, and this is called as emission filter. What do you understand by emission filter? Emission filter's function is just simple. It will remove the noise. What do I mean by noise? I'm not trying to say that there would be some kind of a noise or sound over here, and this emission filter would be aiding us in removing that noise. No, nothing like that. By noise I mean that it would be removing any extra fluorescence that would be present over here. So any non-required or an extra fluorescence that is present over here would be removed by the emission filter, and then the light would be moving on to the detector. And finally, from the detector you can find out this kind of an image. Okay, let me just move a little back and then see that the dichroic mirror is at a degree of 45 degree from light source as well as from the sample. And it allows the longer wavelength of light to pass through it, and shorter wavelength of light it strikes and gets reflected. What about emission or barrier filter? What about this? Emission or barrier filter, basically it blocks extraneous excitatory light or background fluorescence. What did I say? It will be blocking any extra or noise type of thing. I hope this is clear to you. Okay, I explained you how this fluorescence microscopy works. That means I told you what about the principle as well as the mechanism of working. Now let us move on to one particular image that has been taken through fluorescence microscopy. Now you can see that, let me just change the color of my pen. Yes, the cytoplasm in this image is red in color. That means you can see over here or over here. So this is the entire cytoplasm that is present, and cytoplasm is present inside the cell. That means this is a cell, complete cell. And what about the nucleus? Nucleus is blue in color. You can see these regions that this is blue in color. Red is cytoplasm, blue is your nucleus, and green is showing you the damaged DNA. You can see that the DNA is damaged over here. You are checking out basically a cancer cell with the help of fluorescence microscopy. What you have done is you have stained different components of the cell using different fluorophores. For example, I have taken a red color emitting or red color fluorescence showing dye that is staining the cytoplasm, a blue fluorescence emitting dye that is used for staining the nucleus, a green fluorescence emitting dye that is used for staining the damaged DNA. So this kind of a complete image is obtained if you use fluorescence microscopy. So this is such a beautiful image, and you can localize what is present where is the cytoplasm, where is the DNA, where is the nucleus. You can locate everything, and then you can pinpoint, yes, that the problem is particularly here. Right? So this was the explanation of the entire fluorescence microscopy. At times I have seen that they ask Stokes shift in the examination, they ask fluorescence microscopy principle, they can ask you the relationship between energy and lambda. That is, of course, they won't ask you directly, but yes, in indirect ways they can ask you. So I hope this topic was clear to you. If you liked the video, please hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, don't forget to press the bell icon, and keep tuned to watch more videos. Thank you so much. Have a good day.